The transition period after the UK leaving the EU has been anything but smooth. Boris Johnson's chief Brexit negotiator has been accused of treating the EU and the UK as if they are living on two different planets after vowing to break all regulatory ties with Brussels. In this edition of the debate, we will look at whether this will continue to be a messy divorce, whether the EU is set to make an example of the UK when it comes to any country thinking of leaving the EU.
Britain's departure from the European Union on January 31st has failed to put an end to the long and torturing post-Brexit process. While both sides have less than a year to secure a free trade deal, comments coming out from London and Brussels have once again disclosed serious discrepancies between them. The EU says if the UK wants access to the single market, it has to respect the bloc's rules.
Nothing comes for free, so access to the single market is of high value. It's the largest single market in the world. It's of utmost importance, and therefore I think it's only a matter of fairness to also play by the rules then.
The bloc has also reminded the British government that a level playing field approach is mandatory for future talks.
Everybody understands that for the EU, a big priority is level playing field. In other words, the way in which goods are produced needs to be equivalent in the UK as in the rest of the EU.
But Britain says it won't follow EU-imposed level playing field rules. UK's chief Brexit negotiator David Frost added Prime Minister Boris Johnson won't accept supervision from the EU as part of a free trade deal after Brexit. Frost said Britain will set its own standards, even if that means giving up privileged access to the EU single market. Those opposing views, as France has warned, mean that the EU and Britain must expect a bruising battle.
I think that on issues of trade or the future relationship which we're embarking on, we're going to tear ourselves apart. But that's part of the negotiations. Everyone defends their own interests.
Moreover, almost all member states of the EU have questioned whether it is even possible to conclude a free trade agreement by the end of 2020. But Johnson has reiterated he would not be asking for an extension beyond December 31st. The situation inside the UK adds to the complexities of the post-Brexit era for Johnson. The British Retail Consortium has warned that British consumers will face higher prices and limited ranges of goods in the event of a return to custom controls after the Brexit transition period. The UK-based banking giant HSBC has also warned that there will be meaningful job cuts in the UK over the next 3 years. Also, the issue of the Scottish independence remains a big trouble for Downing Street. Soon after Britain's withdrawal from the EU, First Minister Nicola Sturgeon said the main task of her party was to pursue with more vigor what she called the legitimate Scottish independence bid. All these suggest that 2020 will be replete with domestic and foreign challenges for Johnson. He says Britain is now free and able to reach profitable free trade deals with Canada, Australia and other countries. But Britain's fears such deals will cost ruining the long-held economic and political ties with the European Union.
The guest joining us for this edition of the debate, author and lecturer Jonathan Fryer joins us from London. We have publisher and editor at Politics First, Marcus Papadopoulos, who joins us also from London. I'd like to welcome you both. Jonathan Fryer, let me first start with you. This setting of own rules, quote unquote, is what's making the headlines in some sense, where Boris Johnson's chief Brexit negotiator, David Frost, has said that, and he has set out the UK's stance ahead of the post-Brexit negotiations, which is due to start next month. I mean, is that what he thinks he's going to be able to achieve?
Well, it's what he's saying as the opening negotiation position. Obviously, in all negotiations, one starts with one position in the hope of meeting a compromise somewhere along the line. But I have to say what both David Frost and the Prime Minister Boris Johnson have said is so extreme, in the sense that they've said basically that Britain has taken back control of its laws and its rules, and it's not going to accept EU standards and the level playing field that was mentioned in the introduction to the programme. And that's going to make it very difficult indeed to have any trade agreement with the EU, and in particular to reach that agreement before the end of this year. So there's a growing feeling here in London that actually what is more likely to happen is that at the end of the year there will be no deal, and we will go on to WTO rules trading with the rest of the world, which is what many people in the Conservative Party actually want.
Well, Marcus Papadopoulos, let me give you a couple quotes of this Brexit negotiator of Johnson, David Frost, what he has said. He said that the UK must have the ability to set laws that suit us, that it is central to our vision that we must have this ability. The claim that the right that every other non-EU country in the world has. I mean, that doesn't sound like there's going to be a compromise there.
Well, it needs to be said, first of all, that the UK, upon leaving the European Union, was not confronted with the crisis that people from the Remain camp claimed would occur. So there were no shortages of food or medicine in Britain following Brexit. And on top of that, there were no queues going on for miles and miles at British ports. And on top of that, in recent days, the governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, has now expressed words of optimism about Brexit. And let us not forget that Mark Carney, not so long ago, was expressing feelings of doom and gloom about Brexit. Now, turning to whether Britain and the European Union can conclude a trade agreement with each other, I sense a feeling of deja vu here. Because this time last year, there were questions about can the House of Commons approve an agreement, a leaving agreement put forward by the British government. It did. There was also the question of will Britain really leave the European Union? Well, it did. Now, 1 year on, Britain has left the European Union. Britain is now in a post-Brexit world, and Britain and the EU have until the 31st of December of this year to conclude a trade agreement. And I sincerely hope that London and Brussels do strike an agreement, because it will be mutually beneficial for the economy of the European Union and also for the economy of Britain. But of course, if an agreement is not reached by London and Brussels by the end of this year, then Britain will trade with the European Union in accordance with WTO rules. Now, that is not going to be a catastrophe. That is not going to be a disaster. It will not be. It will not be conducive to companies operating in Britain and companies operating in the European Union. But it is certainly not going to result in a collapse of either the European Union economy or the British economy. Whilst on the one hand, I don't believe that Brexit will deliver the golden future for ordinary Britons that people in the Brexit camp are claiming. On the other hand, I do believe that there was a lot of scaremongering about Brexit. You know, the UK economy is one of the oldest and is one of the strongest and robust in the world. It has survived many, many challenges over centuries. Mm-hmm. Indeed, at the end of the Second World War, the UK economy was bankrupt, and within a few years, the British economy was back up and running, albeit with US loans. So yes, an agreement should be reached between London and Brussels, but if it's not, then both the EU and Britain will keep on trading with each other.
Okay, so maybe you can explain to us, Jonathan Fryer, if you can, what Britain's trade negotiator has said here. He says that he's not going to accept the EU supervision when it comes to areas of trade, obviously, in exchange for close trade ties. What does that exactly mean? First of all, what does the EU want, in other words, when it says it wants supervision? Because if it deems something not to be right, what will it do is a question that comes out of that.
Well, indeed. I mean, basically, the central question is all about EU standards, especially in matters such as foodstuffs and products, because there are very strict EU rules about standards that must be met, which have been excellent for the health and safety of consumers in this country and in all other EU member states. Now, what the EU is saying basically is Britain cannot expect to export things to the EU which fall short of those standards. And the way that that decision would normally be dealt with would be through the European Court of Justice. And this is the real sticking point, because Boris Johnson and the Conservative government have said very firmly they're not going to abide by anything that the European Court of Justice says. And that's going to be very difficult, because it would then mean having to go to some sort of WTO process, which is very lengthy and very awkward. And I have to say, I don't share Marcus's optimism about the future, or the short-term future, of Britain's trade. He mentioned that there has been no disaster yet, no queues, etc. But that quite simply is because although technically we left the European Union on the 31st of January, in fact we're still following EU rules and standards until the end of this year. And so of course there's been no impact, real impact yet, on trade. This will all come at the end, on the 1st of January 2021, if there is no trade deal in place.
Do you agree with that then? I'm guessing you disagree with that, Marcus Papadopoulos, but does Jonathan Fryer have a point?
Well, look, I should clarify my position. I do not believe that Brexit is going to result in the UK economy falling out of the top 10 most powerful economies in the world. But at the same time, I do not subscribe to the argument put forward by members of the Brexit camp that a golden future awaits Britain. I do not believe that ordinary British families, ordinary British households up and down the UK will benefit in the slightest way from having left the European Union. And at the same time, I don't think that ordinary British families will have benefited if they remained in the European Union. Why do I say that? Because economically speaking, the European Union and the UK are two sides of the same coin. They are both, the British economy and the EU economy are both corporate capitalist models. And under corporate capitalist models, ordinary people, the working man and woman, is always going to suffer. There are 14 million British people living in poverty today. There are 4 million children living below the breadline. Now, those numbers would not have reduced if Britain had remained in the European Union. But at the same time, those numbers are not going to reduce now that Britain has left the European Union. What is important, however, is that foreign investors in the UK have retained confidence in their investments in Britain. And specifically, I'm talking about the Japanese, the Chinese, and the Indians. Because if the Chinese, the Japanese, and the Indians had lost confidence in a UK outside of the EU and had withdrawn their investments, then that would have been very serious for the British economy. But that is not what has happened. And I can only emphasize the point, again, that the UK economy is very robust. And I accept the European Union economy is also very robust. It is in the interests for the EU and Britain to conclude a trade deal. They have approximately a year. Now, a year in politics and in diplomacy is not a long time, but we have been here before, where commentators are saying that an agreement could never be reached, that Britain would never leave the European Union. And the House of Commons did approve a deal, and Britain did leave the European Union. So I think that we should be more optimistic, but I just want to clarify my stance.
Very well.
That, you know, not an emphatic supporter of Brexit or leave.
Well, let's not beat around the bush. Let's look at what the UK wants first, Jonathan Fryer. And it says straight up, Canada trade agreement by the name of CETA. So the UK says that's what it wants. Maybe you can explain to us what that is and whether it's going to get it.
Well, basically the Canada trade agreement is something that was negotiated over a period of 7 years between Brussels and Canada, which gives tariff-free access to most Canadian goods and vice versa, but doesn't cover a whole range of areas such as services. But although the British side has said very clearly it's looking for a sort of Canada-style agreement, Michel Barnier, the main EU negotiator, said very clearly today That's absolutely out of the question. Canada is the other side of the Atlantic and has a totally different sort of trading pattern with EU than Britain, which is absolutely next door. There's only 30 kilometres between Britain and France, and indeed a huge amount of trade goes across that narrow strait between Dover and Calais. So basically, Mr. Barnier has said very clearly that the Canada deal is not on the table. It has to be something different, something special, which acknowledges that Britain, even if it's left the EU formally, is still part of Europe and is the EU's close neighbour, and therefore must be much more closely aligned than if it were several thousand kilometres the other side of the Atlantic.
Well, let's talk about the elephant in the room, Marcus Papadopoulos, and that would be the United States, i.e. the U.S. President Donald Trump. Now, I'm guessing that, well, I shouldn't guess, but there are obviously news about how Trump is with open arms waiting for Johnson, if Johnson hasn't already, to give them the best trade deal, as Donald Trump has stated. Now, is that something that Johnson has in mind, and his negotiator, I guess, when they move forward with the EU? I mean, do these three have connections with each other when it comes to decisions that are being made, particularly, obviously, Johnson for the UK and the EU?
I believe it's highly probable and, in fact, inevitable that now that Britain has withdrawn from the European Union, that it is going to pursue very close political, or let me rephrase that, even closer political and economic ties with the Anglo-Saxon world. And the Anglo-Saxon world comprises, of course, Britain and America, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And I believe that the world will witness a strengthening of the Anglo-Saxon world, which I believe potentially could be troublesome. But turning to America, I believe that Britain has to pursue trade deals with countries such as America, which will be both advantageous and long-term trade deals for the UK economy. But I strongly suspect that any trade deal with America will benefit the Americans more so. So I am concerned, for example, about a deal with Washington, a deal between London and Washington, which will result in the Americans having access to Britain's National Health Service. I believe that Britain, following the June 2016 referendum, we heard a lot of talk from British politicians, supporters of Brexit, that trade deals would actually be concluded before Britain left the European Union. Well, that never happened. So I do believe that Britain is somewhat desperate to conclude trade deals, and inevitably Britain will look to the Anglo-Saxon world to conclude trade deals. But with America, I believe that the Americans will approach a trade deal with Britain from a position of strength, and I believe that the British will agree to a trade deal which will be more advantageous to the Americans than it will be to the British. And at the same time, let us not forget, when it comes to Australia, yes, there probably will be a deal between Australia and Britain, but at the same time, Australia views a reinvigorated Britain in Southeast Asia as a rival, because of course Australia has a lot of economic interests in that part of the world. So nothing is clear-cut for Britain now that it is out of the EU.
Okay. Well, Jonathan Fryer, one thing we need to talk about here is Scotland. You have the Scottish First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, who has said that Brexit has actually paved the way for Scottish independence. This was in a speech that she gave on January 31st. So, obvious question, is another Scottish independence vote possible?
Well, it's certainly possible. It's not definite yet because, of course, the government in Westminster has the final say about whether there is going to be another referendum or not. But what's quite clear is that there's a very strong feeling in Scotland that they are very unhappy about leaving the EU, and therefore many of them, not all of course, but many of them feel that it would be appropriate to have another referendum if Scotland, as an independent country, could rejoin the EU easily, as Brussels has indicated perhaps it could. But Boris Johnson is not going to agree to a Scottish referendum anytime soon, that's for certain, because he doesn't want to be seen as the Prime Minister who breaks up the United Kingdom, though in the end I think that may well be his legacy, not only seeing Scotland depart, but also Northern Ireland, which also didn't want to leave the EU, joining the Republic of Ireland in a United Ireland situation. So it's a very, very sensitive political issue, but going to be a crucial one over the next few years.
Okay, Marcus Papadopoulos, in closing, I think you have a reaction. Go ahead.
Whilst I'm sympathetic to the argument put forward by Scottish nationalists for Scotland to have independence from the UK, we have to face reality. As a result of last December's general election, the Conservative Party is now entrenched in power. Indeed, the Conservative Party will more than likely be in power for the next 10 years. So there is no chance within the next 10 years of there being an independence referendum in Scotland. And no Conservative Prime Minister will consent to that. And let's just say that if Labour comes to power, or if Labour hope to come to power in the next 10 years, then it would be political suicide for the next Labour leader to agree to an independence referendum in Scotland. Because if Labour cannot regain the ground it once lost in Scotland, then it is very difficult to see how Labour can ever form a government again in the UK. So no Conservative leader will agree to it, and it's very, very doubtful that any Labour leader will agree to it. But as I said moments ago, the Conservative Party is entrenched in power. The Conservatives will be in power for at least the next decade.
Very well, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much. Author and lecturer Jonathan Fryer from London spoke to us, and you were just listening to Marcus Papadopoulos, publisher and editor at Politics First. Thanks for tuning in to another edition of The Debate. From me, Kavitav, the entire team in the capital, Tehran, is goodbye.